Fascism is basically the name for an economic system, even though the word has been used for many things. But in economics, fascism is when the government is called in. The government steps in to reinforce, to support, to sustain private capitalist enterprises. You see, those private capitalist enterprises left to themselves are falling apart. They can't sell their goods, they can't maintain their job roles, they lay people off, they cut back, they plunge people into a situation of no job, no income, no prospects. It's a mass suffering. And the capitalist system is called into question when people see it performing this badly. That's what happened in 1929 that led into the Great Depression of the 1930s. And that is what happened in 2008 that led to the last 10 years of economic crisis, of political upheaval, where the strong men could emerge and have an audience, etc. The fascist solution to capitalism's breakdown is to bring in the government to support private capitalist enterprises. It is sometimes referred to as a merging of the government and private enterprise. Not to go to another system, but to keep the existing system going. What does the government do in fascism? Well, it helps private capitalists by getting rid of the trade unions and replacing them with its own organizations, run by the government, controlled so that they support rather than challenge private capitalists. Here's a second one. The government comes in and does for private companies what they couldn't do for themselves. It rearranges foreign trade so that domestic capitalists have an easier time selling their goods abroad and blocking imports so they can sell to their own people because the government has prevented imports from coming in, say by, I don't know, tariffs would be one way to arrange this sort of thing. The government comes in and deregulates. That's a clever term to say that the regulations that are costly to capitalists are removed, and the regulations that help them are enhanced. That's typically what fascists do. And they typically like to boost the economy by an enormous expenditure on the military, putting people to work in the military and putting people to work producing the guns, the bullets, the planes, and the uniforms of those people in military as a tremendous way to stimulate and support and to profit private capitalist enterprises. Military and capitalists, government and capitalists merging together to run the system in a way that builds up capitalism, captures what has to be done that the capitalists couldn't do for themselves, and makes the system have some more life. It's all about saving.
Another right-wing blogger recently promoted an interview that you and I did, kind of Marxism 101, and he was shouting out to his audience saying, look at this, he said, a Marxist professor unironically praising the Soviet economy. Can you believe this? And, I watched the interview again, and isn't it a fact, though, that the Soviet economy, it had a planned economy, it did have some amazing developments because it was planned, and can't you uncouple that from its political failures?
Absolutely. For me, it is the most bizarre kind of willful ignorance to make believe that the Soviet Union, and for that matter the People's Republic of China, haven't succeeded at economic growth. You can be critical of all kinds of things about those societies. I am, in many ways, critical of various parts. But that doesn't require making things up. You have to be careful. Economically, the Soviet Union, Russia, was the poorest part of Europe in 1917, just like China was one of the poorest parts of the world in 1949 when they each had their revolutions. They set themselves a number one priority, to stop being poor and become instead rich, or at least a lot richer than they had been, something which Americans understand as an objective because a lot of us include that among the things we would like to do. So then, as economists know, you measure how much did their economy grow. You can measure it by the amount of goods and services they were able to produce. You can measure it by the standard of living or the average wages workers got. But whichever way you measure it, the 20th century, Soviet Russia, was a period of spectacular economic growth. They paid a heavy price socially, culturally, but they achieved economic growth. So from being the most backward country in Europe in 1917, when their revolution happened, to 1975, when they were a mature economy, they had gone from the poorest part of Europe to the second most important economy after that of the United States. An amazing achievement, considering that there were 2 world wars in between all of that they had to overcome. And the same can be said, by the way, for China. Mm-hmm. Over the last 25 years, counting from right now, the Chinese economy went from one of the poorest backward to the second one after the United States, fast catching up. Extraordinary. Average annual rate of growth of output in China over the last 25 years, roughly 10%. Average rate of growth over the last 25 years in the United States, 3%. That's not even close. They are catching up because they are doing it faster and better than anyone has done it before. Now, partly they're learning the lessons of countries that went before them, but everybody's trying to do that. China has been number one in world economic growth for the last 20 years, out of all the countries on the planet. I mean, whatever you say about them has to be said taking into account these realities. Let me be as stark as I can imagine. Over the last 20 years, the average real wage in America, the amount of money you get for a job, connected to the prices you have to pay, so it's a measure of how much you can really afford with your average wage, has been stagnant in the United States. We have about the same real wage now that we did 20 years ago. In China, over the same time, the average real wage has quadrupled. I mean, you can play around it, you can pretend it isn't there, but then you're a little bit like the child who's 2 years old, scared by a dog, puts the fingers in front of their eyes and imagines the dog goes away until they're a little bit more mature and realize you can do that, but the dog is still there. The experience of Russia and China in economic growth is the textbook example of rapid economic growth.
Yeah, it's kind of a lie by omission. I remember Obama giving some big economic speech kind of praising capitalism and talking about the billions of people that have been lifted out of poverty. Of course, if you remove China from that equation, the numbers are quite different, right?
That's right. That's right. It's really an amazing need to pretend, in almost the old Cold War sense, that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. And that the way you keep reaffirming that is pushing everything that's bad onto their responsibility and everything that's good is ours. It's what we mock in a politician who takes credit for everything that's good and finds someone to blame for everything that's bad. You know, like Mr. Trump. And we make jokes about it, but we ought to be careful lest we fall into the same habit.
Capitalism is a peculiar arrangement for the economy. A worker cuts a deal with an employer. I agree to come to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week. You agree to pay me. And out of this agreement, we will get together. The problem is, when you do that, of course, that you put conflict right at the core of the system, because the employer wants to get as much out of you while paying you the least possible, and the worker wants to get the biggest salary possible. So there's conflict built in, and that needs a lot of people who are supervisors and forepersons to watch, because it's a conflicted system. But it is a way of organizing production. For example, from the old way, landlord-serf, as in feudalism, or master-slave, as in slaves. And we have a system in which everything then is a deal. And the deal of the worker and the employer is matched by the other big deal, buying and selling.
Well, so where does the extra come from? I mean, if I'm giving you some of my labor in return for a salary, and you're getting in return for my labor a thing getting made that you can sell, how do stockholders get rich?
It's
Shareholders.
called a surplus. It's a very old idea. It's been as old as capitalism, because capitalism is a wonderful example. I know, everybody knows that if you go and sit down with an employer and you discuss the job you'd like to get, and you and the employer finally work it out, and now comes the big one. How much am I going to get paid? And you work that out, and let's say it's $20 an hour. So you agree to come 40 hours a week, typically. You will get paid $20 an hour. What do you already know? You know that the employer would never pay you $20 an hour if in that hour that you worked, you didn't produce more than $20 worth of extra for your employer to sell. Because the way capitalism works is you use your brains and muscles to work. You produce goods and services. At the end of the day, you go home, the goods and the services stay there. And if you take them with you, people in blue uniforms come and bother you. So you leave it there. And you know, too, that they would only pay you $20 an hour, or $50 or $1,000. If in that hour you added more of what they sell than it cost them to hire you. You produce more than you get. And I know this upsets particularly Americans who watch these explanations, because we all would like to believe that we would never work for anyone who doesn't pay us what we're worth. Capitalism, however, is a system that cannot and will never do that. It will only pay you less than what your labor produces for them. And that's where profit comes from.
Do you think that Jeff Bezos works hundreds of thousands of times harder than his workers? Why should he be the richest person in the world?
You don't get compensated based on how hard you work. You get compensated based on the demand for your particular set of skills. There's probably less people that can work in the position that Bezos does than there are people that can work in any other more entry-level position at Amazon.
Wow. Okay.
Wait, do you disagree with that? Do you think just as many people could handle being the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company as could handle being somebody that works in a grocery store or a fast food restaurant? Is there a simple yes or no to that, or am I about to get another lecture?
Well, you don't want an answer. You just want the answer you want. You don't want it in a form that I would prefer.
Can I get an answer that doesn't involve feudalism?
That's not cute. Is that what the point is here?
Okay.
Why don't you just let me respond without coaching me how to do it? Can we do that?
Okay, I'll give you 2 minutes. We'll go there.
Fine. The idea advanced by you earlier that you don't have one person walk away with $200 billion, roughly the estimate of Bezos's worth, and the vast majority of his employees unable to pay for their kids to go to college, is a distribution of the profits of that business that is morally reprehensible. That's how the wealth was accumulated, by the distributions of dividends to shares, share expansion, and share improvement in value. We have a system that rewards one person with $200 billion and another one with $30,000. That's a remarkable decision to make in a community that calls itself democratic, or that likes to believe it wants to give people a fair and equal chance. No fairness here, no equality. It is revolting to me that anyone could find this reasonable. And to explain it by saying there's a demand, that's simply what the corporations give each other, the demand. They're the ones who create the demand, which they then fill with themselves, because they're the ones who hire each other for that job. It's a remarkable self-serving system where the folks at the top give themselves as much as they can get away with.
So it's comforting in that situation to get the idea from somewhere that this really isn't a problem of capitalism as a system, but rather the problem brought in somehow from the outside, monopoly, a situation in which competition among many companies gives way in some way we're not quite sure about, to a domination by one or a small handful of companies. And so the argument goes, we don't have to be critical of capitalism. We don't have to think about an alternative system. No. We just have to deal with this little detail, the monopoly problem. And if we can deal with that, well, we'll get back to a competition, to a competitive capitalism that is good. There are three big mistakes involved in this way of thinking, which is nonetheless very widespread and very popular, more so now than in quite some years. First mistake. Capitalism has been wrestling with the problem of monopoly from day one. We have had repeated periods of monopoly. They have eventually led to movements, often of many people, to destroy or remove monopoly. We used to call that in America trust busting or antitrust. We even have a department within the Department of Justice in Washington devoted to antitrust activities. Yeah, we've been waging battles against monopoly over and over again, and you know why? Because we keep having monopolies over and over again. Google is a monopoly. Amazon is a monopoly. They're all around us. Companies that have effectively no real competition. This is a problem that capitalism has always displayed, and that ought to lead you to wonder whether thinking about it as something we can do away with isn't maybe the best possible example of wishful thinking. The second big mistake is to imagine that competition is some unmixed blessing. It never was, and it isn't today. A competitive market is a human institution. Like every other human institution, it has strengths and flaws and weaknesses. To think of competition as some magical perfection is a silly abnegation of your own rational capability to evaluate something. It's sort of advertising thinking. By that I mean the advertiser tells you what's good about the product they've been told to advertise. They don't tell you what's bad about it. If you want to evaluate it, you don't talk to an advertiser because they only give you one side. The people who promote competition use advertising logic. We're not going to do that here. Competition is no unmixed blessing. And finally, I'm going to show you that competition is itself the major cause of monopoly, so that even if we ever got back to a competitive capitalism, that all that would mean is we're back.
We sell ourselves. That is, we try to find an employer, and we try to persuade the employer we have skills that they will find profitable, that we have energy that they can use to make profit. We sell ourselves. And for Marx, this is a remarkable thing. Other people never did that, but we do that. We put ourselves aside as human beings and sell our capacity to do something profitable for another. And we sell it for the day or for the week or however long the contract. And Marx said that affects your psychology. Then he took it another step. He said, and while you're working during the day, what are you doing? You're using your brains, your muscles, to perform work activity at the computer or on the assembly line or wherever it might be. And then something happens at the end of the day. You've poured yourself, your brains and muscles, into this work that you've done. But you go home. You must go home to your own home, and you leave in the hands of somebody else what you have produced. That's part of you. That is part of your creativity, your effort, your genius. And it automatically belongs to somebody else. Marx then says, you are alienated from your own product. And human beings, he said, want to be involved in and engaged with what they produce, starting with little children whose first act is to make a picture and show it to mommy and dad. This is my picture, and to have it tacked on the wall of their room as a kind of testimony to their creativity. But in capitalism, the worker is shunned at the end of the day. You go home. You have nothing to do, nothing to say about what we do with the fruits of your labor. We may sell it, we may destroy it. It's none of your business. It's another group of people who weren't even involved in the production who have all the power. Marx says this, his language of the time, you are
losing connection with yourself. You are being cut off from your own product, and that takes a toll on you. And Marx argued that workers suffer from this experience, internalize it, feel somehow that maybe they deserved this experience, turn in on themselves, and maybe need, at the end of the day, to go and have a happy hour for a couple hours to get over because they've just been abused in a way. And the alienation has long-term political effects. If you're denied at the workplace some say over what the fruits of your labor are, how excited are you going to be to get involved in politics? You're actually being trained every day to not be involved in making the big decisions of how you work and what's done with your labor. You're cut off from that. You're diminished as a human being. You're alienated from your capacities as a person to have some say and some control over what happens in your life. And it's very damaging, Marx argues, to people to be stuck in a capitalist system that alienates them from themselves in this way. We are the year 2022. 100 years ago, 1922, is when fascism really begins in Europe. 1922 is the year of something called the March on Rome. It was October of 1922 when Mussolini led the March on Rome and took over in what was basically a coup d'etat, taking over the Italian government. And he then instituted a fascist regime. It lasted from 1922 until around 1944. At that point, it came to an end, and Mr. Mussolini was hung upside down in the street and killed by the people that he had led, which tells you something about fascism. Hopefully, you will remember. The next case of fascism happens 11 years later. It's January 1933, and in Germany, the government there turns itself over. Didn't require quite the coup d'etat, but it took not that different a form, turned the government over to the leader of a fascist political party, like Mussolini in Italy, only his name was Adolf Hitler, and he was head of the Nazi Party. And a few years later, in 1936, a democratically elected government in Spain was overthrown by an illegal military revolt of General Franco, who waged a civil war, displaced that government, and established Spanish fascism, which lasted several decades. And then he died. And Spain reverted back to a non-fascist arrangement. Those are the three major fascisms we know about. And what I'm about to tell you is what we know from what they actually did. Before each of them, capitalism, the dominant economic system in each of those three countries, was content with and satisfied with what we are familiar with as parliamentary democratic government. You know, elections every year, people elected to one or two house legislature, like our Congress, and going about the normal business of running a capitalist society. Everybody gets to vote, we pay a lot of attention, but the people with the money, the capitalists, the wealthy, the big CEOs, they run the show because they donate to the parties, they donate to the candidates, their lobbyists help write the laws. We're all familiar with that because we're used to that here too. The problem is, in each of those countries, the capitalism that was normally perfectly happy with conventional representative electoral democracy was falling apart. The capitalism was producing such suffering, such anger, such bitterness among the mass of people that there was a developing anti-capitalist movement. And this scared the capitalist class, the owners of the enterprises, the big CEOs. They could see the handwriting on the wall. In Italy, just before fascism, you had the greatest general strike in the history of the country in Torino, led by a then obscure
communist named Antonio Gramsci, who becomes one of the great communist theoreticians of the 20th century. Terrified people. In 1917, a few years before, an anti-capitalist revolution in Russia succeeded, terrified capitalists everywhere in the world, here in the US too. So there was this sense it's falling apart, our system. And when that happens, there's a strong push, doesn't always succeed, but a strong push to push aside representative democracy, all of that, and have the iron heel, the iron fist. Change the government from that game to one where its job is to control the society, repress every critic of capitalism you can find, do it all in the name of the race or the nation or patriotism, to give it all a better sounding name than saying we're going to save capitalism by crushing everybody who disagrees with it, everybody who has turned against it. So it is done in the name of, well, the nation, nationalism. It's a good way of covering it over. Everything we're doing is not about preserving capitalism. That's the real agenda. It's about preserving the nature, or preserving white America, if you bring it over into us, or preserving the Italian soul, or preserving genuine Spain, whatever it was always the same. And here's what it involved. You crush the labor unions. You either kill them, that happened often, jail them, exile them, no more labor unions. You go after the socialists, you go after the communists. Antonio Gramsci, the leader of the Communist Party in Italy, the leader of that great strike, was imprisoned by Mussolini and spent the last 20 years of his life in jail. Hitler killed people, so that was easier. And in the Spanish Civil War, vast numbers of people were killed as well. So that's what it is. It's capitalism enforced. You still have employers and employees, like capitalism before. The leaders of the capitalist industries remained there unless they were deemed to be not part of the nation. Don't be fooled. Underneath the veneer of the government coming in is the ultimate purpose: protect capitalism. That's why it's there. That's why this is done.
Richard Branson, multi-billionaire, he wants a universal income for all. His rationale is that robots are taking over. Somebody's got to provide an income for the people who lose their jobs. In favor of that? In principle, are you in favor of a universal income?
No.
Really?
No.
Why not?
I told you, socialism, Marxism, these things are changing and rethinking just like everybody else. Here's what I don't like about the universal basic income. I like the idea that we can take care of everybody, and we ought to as a nation. What I don't like is to divide society into those who work and earn their income and those who don't work and still get an income. I don't see that as healthy. I don't see that as fair. And I see that as a prescription for trouble down the road. Here's my suggestion. When we have technological change like robots, computers, let the work day be shortened. Make everybody work to do their fair share and so participate in the benefits of technology with a shorter work week for everybody, so nobody gets an income without working and no one works without getting an income. That would be a better way to take care of people than what we do now, which is use technology to make a lot of profits for people, throw a lot of people out of work, and then be surprised when they're at each other.
Did you realize?
100 years ago, 1916 to be precise, was the first time that the Socialist Party of America put forward a candidate for president. His name was Alan Benson, was his name. And he ran for president 1916, 100 years ago, and he got 600,000 votes in the United States. We were a much smaller country then, and that worked out to 3% of the vote. Okay, the Socialist Party thought that was a good beginning, so they ran again 4 years later in 1920, a little less than 100 years ago. And they had a different candidate, a man named Eugene Victor Debs, head of the Railway Workers Union, very good orator. And he did better. He got 900,000 votes. That's a 50% increase in 4 years, 4% of the total vote. 4 years later, Another socialist ran, 1924. Only he changed the name, because by that time the fear of socialism had led to an enormous effort by the government, most famously the Palmer raids up in Boston, hounding communists and socialists and arresting them and all of that. And people got a little scared. So what the third effort was, they changed the name. They didn't call it the Socialist Party. They called it the Progressive Party. And they ran a man from Wisconsin named Robert La Follette, famous politician from Wisconsin. He ran for president on the Progressive, but he was clearly a socialist like the others. Okay? He got 5 million votes. They went up 5 times.
Wow.
It worked out to 17% of the total vote that year for president. And it was a shot across the bow of American business. They began to realize they had a socialist movement in America that was not only big, but growing fast. And down came a repression that we're still living the results of. Literally a century of demonizing socialists and demonizing radicals and making them feel or be portrayed as alien to America or as odd or as scary or as bomb-throwing lunatics or however the play was done. And we have to understand that we, the socialists of this era, are coming out of a kind of hibernation imposed on us by a winter of repression that comes out of our success 100 years ago. That's why I tell the story of that history, because that's America I'm talking about. That's the United States, where the interest in socialism and the support for it has already been proved. We don't need to claim that we do. We're doing it again, only now under conditions of a capitalism that is not in the ascendance the way it was then. It's a capitalism on the way down. That's why China is so frightening. That's why all of these struggles around the world shake Americans and their confidence that we are not the ascending. The Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians, they're the ascending economic systems now, and it's a scary time for Americans, but it's also a time when you can question a capitalism that isn't working real well for the majority of people. And when capitalism fails this way, when by comparison, as I did earlier with Russia and China, or by comparison with the 1% over the last 30 years versus everybody else, it's not surprising that people in America are finding their way back to socialism. It's built into our history. Capitalism, I would argue, is not working. When the wages stopped rising in America after the 1970s, how did the American standard of living keep going up over the last 30 years when the wages didn't? We borrowed, just like them. But you know, after a while, if your wages are flat and the only way you can increase your standard of living is by borrowing, you don't need rocket science to understand eventually you'll have a level of debt you can't support on a flat wage. The American working class discovered that, which is why we're in a crisis now. And the Greeks discovered it, which is why they're in a crisis now. And the Spanish working class is discovering it. And here in this country, who lent to the working class for 30 years? The business community, who were making a lot of money because the wages were flat for 30 years, and so they cashed in. And they made a lot of money, which they turned around and lent to the workers. Who lent to the Greeks? The Germans, who made a lot of money because they kept their prices down and nobody could compete with them. And so they made a ton of money, which they lent to the poor countries to allow them to keep buying the stuff produced in the rich countries. But when it can't do it anymore, it's over. And you know, here's the irony of ironies. Because the Greeks can't do anything anymore. They have no money. They can't keep their hospitals open. They can't buy anything. So first it's Greece, but already you see the effect on Germany. Germans sell to Spain, to Portugal, to Italy. People aren't buying. The Germans are discovering, oh my goodness, having taken everything to ourselves,
Having lent for a while to the others so we could keep selling to them, now we're not going to lend to them anymore because they can't pay us back. But if we don't lend to them, they can't buy from us. And if they don't buy from us, we're in the soup with them. The system self-destructs. Capitalism is not only, as I said at the beginning, not working for societies like Spain, Italy, Greece, and on and on. It isn't even working for the other ones. It's like the United States. The 1% takes it all. The 99% can't buy anything. And the 1% discover if the 99% can't buy anything, we're shafted. We need them. We need them to buy all this crap. We need them. We need them.
Right. You talk about the different stages of capitalism. Of course, when Marx was alive, he was experiencing an early stage of capitalism, kind of coming off the infancy of feudalism. He never lived to see the stage of capitalism that we're in today, which is monopoly capitalism. Talk about what monopoly capitalism is and how it differs from what Marx was living.
Marx's time was the early time, if you like, of capitalism, so that you had lots of little employers with a few employees competing with one another in the way you might imagine local storekeepers. What has happened is that the competition of capitalists, one with the other, is a process in which there are winners and losers. And people who like competition have a little trouble facing that outcome. But the goal of every competing capitalist is to be the one who wins, not the one who loses. That's not only because the winner makes more money, but typically the loser can't compete and goes out of business. And what that means is his factory or his office or his store can't continue. Well, what do his workers do? Well, they go work for the one who won. Who buys the old equipment that the losing capitalist can't keep going? The one who won. So in effect, the winners not only destroy the business of the losers, they eat the losers. They absorb the losers, whereupon the winners get bigger and bigger until we have, well, let's take an example, the automobile industry. It was once dozens of companies competing to make cars, but now we know a handful of companies dominate. It's monopoly capitalism. Now, in theory, we teach this in economics, there's supposed to be some kind of limit to all of this, but there never has been. So unsuccessful were the efforts of this system to solve this problem that in every society, including our own, we have an antitrust governmental agency whose job it is to watch all of this and intervene to break them up. The way we did, for example, 20 years ago with AT&T, the phone company that used to be the only one, was broken up. But what every history of every capitalist country I know of shows is that the efforts of the government come late in the game, and after a while, the government can't stop it. But why? Because these governments are themselves the creature of the monopolists who learned long ago that by contributing nicely to the candidate, donating nicely to the parties, they can keep antitrust quiet. That's why we have a very few people making almost everything in this country. Apple, Google, they're monopolists. They control huge amounts. They haven't been broken up. Periodically, there's some noise. Gee, these companies, because they're monopolies, because they don't have any competition, are jacking up their prices and making wild profits, all of which is true. I mean, 6 companies dominate the mass media, 6 big banks dominate banking. I mean, it's everywhere that monopoly has been the product of capitalism. Even when the government is called in to limit this, it hasn't in fact worked. So for us, those of us who are economists and watch this, listening on the 4th of July to businessmen and women praising competition is bizarre, because you're praising something that isn't there and hasn't been there for a long time, and that the capitalism you love is systematically provoking and rewarding everybody who achieves a monopoly, which is why they all try to do that, because they've figured out that it's good not to listen to the speech, which is a rationalization on the 4th of July, but to live in the real world where monopoly is the norm.
And of course, this kind of instates a permanent war economy. Now we have these imperialist endeavors that are just essentially to protect capital enterprises around the world and expand the capital that's already there. I mean, it's pretty disturbing.
Yeah. Well, that's a historical issue. When the Great Depression hit this country, 1929, 1941, and everything that the government tried to do, and it did important things. It created Social Security, it created government jobs, but it was, however valuable, it was never enough. It never really solved the problem. And that became a real serious problem because here's capitalism plunging the economy into a 10-year depression, unable to get out. And what finally put Americans back to work wasn't some government policy, and certainly wasn't anything the capitalist private economy sector did. It was war. World War II. We literally took half the people who were unemployed and put them in uniform, and the other half who were unemployed went to work producing the uniforms and the guns and the ships and everything else. The one way we got full employment was by going to war. The government builds good quality, low-cost housing. We're not going to need the private apartment builders. And they didn't like that. Ditto, when we build roads, that is a competition. There was a question of how that could be done that might not be a competition for private. But there's one area where there's no problem, the military. Mm-hmm. You produce a rocket, you shoot it off into space. There is nobody losing money by this. In fact, an enormous array of businesses began to see payday. The government would be the endless buyer. As soon as you built one weapon, the other side would build one. You'd need a new one. And so it would never run out. There'd never be too many. There'd never be a shortage. And you could buy the politicians to keep this game going. It was so attractive and it was so profitable that very quickly the military and the businesses saw they had a deal made in heaven. Over. Certainly more than it has over the behavior of its business opponents, the employer class, or the government officials beholden to that employer class. So what is it that the labor movement has done to hurt itself? I think there are basically two things. One, it permitted the anti-communist political witch hunts and purges after World War II to not only do their damage in and to the labor movement, but they continue to permit that to go on. What do I mean? During the Great Depression, socialists, communists, Marxists, anarchists, all in huge numbers became good, hard labor union militants, bringing millions of Americans to the labor movement, helping to build most of the major labor unions and certainly the industrial unions that came into being under the CIO at that time. After the war, these labor militants were rebranded under the impetus of the government and the business community. They went from being labor militants, the heroes and heroines of the labor movement's extraordinary accomplishments during the 1930s and early 40s. They went from that to being dangerous, traitorous agents of a foreign power, namely the Soviet Union. The coalition that had produced the New Deal, that had turned FDR from a middle-of-the-road Democrat to a Bernie Sanders type of progressive, had included the Communist Party, two socialist parties, and the massive CIO labor union movement. The purpose of the purges after World War II was to break and destroy that coalition. It targeted first the Communist Party because they were the easiest to rebrand as foreigners, dangerous, traitorous, un-American, etc. And no sooner had the Communist Party been effectively destroyed
then those same forces went around telling everybody that socialism was the same thing as communism, they just spelled it differently. And then they went to work on what was left of the coalition, the CIO. And the last 50 to 60 years is the history of the relentless destruction. The role of the unions in enabling this to happen was to go along with it, which not all, but most unions did. They became the agents of the purge, getting rid of their militants, being very uncareful in who they threw out, under what charge, with what proof, and for what real reason. They did the work of those seeking to destroy the labor movement. And so I would argue that one of the ways forward now is to finally end the Cold War inside the union movement. Welcome the militants. Urge them to join. Don't permit people who are enemies of the labor movement to tell you who your friends and enemies are. A very dangerous undertaking. And finally, a piece of advice. The labor movement, the organized unions, need all the allies they can get. If there are organizations in the larger community willing to work with you as a labor union, do so. Welcome them. Build these coalitions. You need them as much as those organizations need allies in the labor movement. And even more important, if they have suggestions for strange changes, in your strategies, after 50 years of decline, you ought to welcome those. You don't have to agree, but you have to take them seriously. And let me offer one of my own. The labor movement would be stronger and more effective getting higher wages and better working conditions if that were not the only objective for them. If the labor movement included a transformation of the system beyond capitalism, so that the top-down hierarchy of the typical capitalist enterprise were replaced by workers themselves owning and operating the enterprises, worker co-ops in a word. If that were understood to be another goal of the United States labor movement, here's something you can bet on. The employer, worried about a big change like that, would be much more willing to come to terms and come to the table to give you better wages and working conditions if that might stave off going for the big prize, which increasingly the people of America want anyway.